out there, Cole Anderson, your host on The Independent Pianist. Welcome back to another video. For everyone who enjoys my performing videos, I'll have more of that coming up soon. I'm just getting to the end of the most busy period of the year for me when it comes to my collaborative work. I just had 1,000,000+1 things that were piling up in the last couple weeks, and I'm actually playing a solo recital next week, and the repertoire on that recital is all stuff that I haven't put on this channel yet, so that will be appearing bit by bit in weeks to come, so just stay tuned. There's going to be plenty of new stuff coming up. For today though, I'm going to offer some hopefully useful advice on how to use the metronome. And the metronome, of course, is kind of an instrument of torture for most of us. We usually hate it at some point in our lives. I certainly have had a love-hate relationship with it. I went through periods where I used it religiously all the time for everything that I practiced. On the other hand, there were times when I totally rejected it as being kind of inhuman, inflexible. I just felt that I couldn't get the results that I wanted from it. I always would get frustrated and discouraged. Well, over time, I've managed to become friends with the metronome, and I really like using it now. And I've reflected a very great deal on how it's useful to me, on why I use it, and in what specific ways one can use it to attain musical goals. First off, I think it is vital to remember that when we play music, even music with a highly technical, mechanical component to it in its rhythm, think of something like the Kapustin First Sonata, for example, which I just uploaded. That's music that does have a certain kind of mechanical nature to its rhythm. Even with that, though, there's always going to be a little aspect of imprecision in human rhythm as compared to what we get when we practice with a metronome. There are always small unevenness, differences in spacing of notes, small imperfections, which ironically equal perfection, actually. In my opinion, at least, we always need these little variants to imbue our rhythm with the kind of life and vitality that it needs. Nonetheless, it's incredibly helpful to learn to play reliably and perfectly strictly with the metronome. First off, using the metronome can really help you develop your inner conductor, your sense of inner pulse, which is so important in music. So often I run into students when I'm teaching who have a great deal of trouble maintaining a steady pulse. You know, one beat will be shorter than another. Sometimes they'll drag if the notes are smaller values, like sixteenths. Other times they will rush like crazy whenever they have long held notes. And these are all natural tendencies. We want to take time to deal with fast things and hurry over when there's nothing much for us to do. Unfortunately, that spells disaster for the music, of course, and eliminates all contrast in the rhythm. We need an underlying musical pulse that should always be going inside our bodies, that allows all the subdivisions of the music to unfurl with just the right proportions. And this underlying pulse should be firm and reliable, but also flexible, mirroring the never-ending beating of our heart that keeps us miraculously alive every moment of the day. So for these students, I usually recommend a couple of exercises. First off, this is kind of optional, I suppose, but I really think it is great to learn the basic conducting patterns and then to try conducting music from recordings. Orchestral music, sure, or anything really. And I used to do this all the time when I was a kid. I had the Dover scores of the Beethoven symphonies that my mom bought me, and I would put on my George Sell and Toscanini recordings and conduct along while reading the score. And that really helped me to develop this kind of internal sense of rhythm that I'm talking about. And the main point here is that you want your sense of rhythm to be separate from the physical act of playing your instrument. Therefore, the most useful basic metronome exercise is to turn on the metronome at a comfortable speed, and then simply to try to clap along with the beat. And for most, this is not so easy the first time. Your goal should be to make the metronome click disappear. You should be precisely with the click when you are clapping. This applies also, of course, when you are playing your instrument with the metronome as well. If you are playing along or clapping along, but you're a little bit ahead or a little bit behind where the click falls, then you're not really getting the most out of your metronome practice. And this is a very common problem. which many people are not even aware of at first. But as soon as you draw your attention to it, you notice this and you can correct that. Anyway, once you can subsume the click to your clapping, you are one with the click, in other words, then you can start subdividing. So just try clapping in other note values like eighth notes, 2 notes per click, in other words, or sixteenths, or triplet eighth notes, etc. And try to space the notes very evenly across the beat. This is another of the great virtues of the metronome. It teaches complete evenness, and you can't really play unevenly effectively until you learn to play precisely evenly. So the most comfortable tempo for all this subdivision business is probably around 80 or somewhere like that. And you'll find that this process of subdivision, or even just clapping the beat, gets exponentially harder the slower your tempo is. People usually think of faster tempos as being more difficult, and that might be true physically. But when it comes to just feeling a tempo and feeling a steady tempo, a beat of like 40 beats per minute, for example, is extremely difficult just to predict exactly where the click is going to fall. On modern digital metronomes, you can even experiment with slower speeds sometimes, 30 beats per minute, 20 beats per minute, and those are extremely difficult, but it can really help you develop this sense of unerring long-range tempo. This approach of using the metronome and clapping is also great for learning polyrhythms, but I'll cover that more in another video. So now to move on to slightly more advanced uses of the metronome, at least one more slightly advanced use of the metronome. The metronome can be used to great advantage to work on almost any passage that you're having trouble playing smoothly. The only requirement really is that the passage be metrically pretty regular so that you actually can use a metronome to fall on the strong beats. It can also be extremely helpful to use the metronome when you're practicing something that you need to learn extremely quickly, because it helps prevent anxiety practicing, and also it helps to structure your thoughts. So a side note about this anxiety practicing, it's something that I've run into many times over the years in my collaborative work. Oftentimes I would find myself in a terrible time crunch. I'm kind of chronically bad about accepting too much work for myself to really learn it all in time. So I would need to learn an overwhelming amount of music in a very short space of time, maybe just a week or 2 weeks at the most. And my anxiety about learning all this music would cause me to rush through easy parts, thereby messing up the rhythmic structure in my mind, causing me to play with less accuracy as soon as I reach something even slightly complicated, and just generally rendering my learning far less effective right when I needed it to be at its best. The weird thing is that I'd be pretty much aware of this too, but I just couldn't stop myself from rushing. The kind of anxiety, the fear of failure was just so strong that I couldn't even do what was best for me, just slow down and take my time. But I found that when I used the metronome at the right speeds, it made the learning process much more effective, very painless, and really helped me to keep my cool under high-pressure deadlines. So now I always use the metronome whenever I need to learn something extremely quickly. The basic approach I'm outlining is basically the same for that as for technically difficult passages. So usually when people recommend practicing with the metronome, the method is some variant of this. Start at a slow pace, well under tempo, and edge your tempo up a notch at a time, higher and higher, approaching your performance tempo. If you run into problems at a certain tempo, it means that you need to go back to a slower tempo and work up again, etc., etc. So this really makes sense on the face of it. I mean, it has very sound reasoning behind it, because certainly you would imagine mastering a passage at every possible tempo gradation from slow to fast should give you much greater technical command in the long run. And in fact, that is the case. However, when I used this method, I always found the results to be hit or miss. More miss than hit, actually. And it really caused me to get frustrated. I thought there was just something wrong with what I was doing or how I was practicing. Of course, there are more nuanced versions of this approach, so I tried one of those as well. One of these versions goes like this. On the first day, you go up one notch at a time until you get stuck. The next day you go up 2 notches, etc. Maybe you try going up 3 notches the next day. And this helped, but still it seemed to waste too much time, and I still would never seem to develop the kind of solidity and reliability that I was looking for. Also, simply to be frank, I just found this method to be kind of boring. I always would lose focus, and it would feel like I would lose solidity in my fingers as my tempo increased, and I couldn't really maintain it. So eventually, over many years of coming back to this method of practicing, I began to devise another method that I think is more effective, and while strangely simple, it maintains greater mental focus. At the same time, you get all the benefits, though, of subtle tempo gradations from slow to fast. This method depended on noticing something kind of interesting about how mechanical metronomes are usually arranged. The numerical progression gets larger as the numbers get higher. So first the numbers increase by 2s, then 3s, then 4s, then 6s, and finally by 8s. This is obviously to maintain the same relative difference in tempo for 1 notch on the metronome as you increase in speed, so that 50 to 52, for example, will feel like a similar difference in tempo as 160 to 168. Also, along with this, I noticed what might seem obvious, that 16 notches always separated 2 numbers in a 1-to-2 ratio. I began to wonder if it might be possible to combine the effectiveness of 1 notch increases in tempo with larger differences. So, after much trial and error, I came up with a chart like this. So the idea here is to contrast 2 tempos 6 notches apart, approximately. I just chose 6 notches because that seemed for me to be the perfect spot where the 2 tempi were different enough to challenge me in a striking way, but similar enough to be relatable. Obviously, you could devise other ratios. This is just what has worked for me most of the time. So for any given section of music that could be played at a single tempo, I would usually select 3 to 5 pairs of tempi to practice in one sitting. So for example, I might start with 80 and then follow that up by playing the passage at 104. Then I would go back to a slower tempo, but a slightly faster tempo than the first tempo, 84. And then jump back up to a slightly faster tempo than my first faster tempo, 108, and then to 88, then to 112, etc. Or if I found the speed of 104 to be a little bit of a stretch, I might instead go backwards down the chart, going next to 76, and then to 100, 72, 96, 69, 92. Ideally, of course, you should be able to play pretty smoothly at both speeds to get the full effect, although if occasionally you have to stop in the faster speeds, it's no particular cause for alarm, it's still helpful. Well, that doesn't seem like such a huge difference, but I was absolutely astounded at the difference this mode of practicing made for my progress. It kept me far more mentally focused because of the extra attention required to shift tempo with each repetition, but I still gained the benefit of the notch at a time progression method. Also, I just found that my slower tempos would actually feel even slower as a result of alternating them with faster tempos, and I'd be able to be much more solid in my faster tempos as a result of having so much more slow playing interwoven into those faster attempts, instead of in the gradual increase variety of practicing, where I would gradually just kind of leave behind the more solid slow tempos. In this way, I'm discovering them both at kind of the same time. So anyway, give this method a try, or adapt it to your own uses, of course. We should never feel stuck with any one particular method, but should always be looking for new ways to practice and master our music. And if you have other techniques that you like to apply to metronome practice, be sure to comment and let me know. I'm always interested in hearing about new methods and ideas. So please like the video, subscribe, leave me your comments. And if you feel like financially supporting this channel, if you really like this content, if it really means something to you, please do consider becoming a financial supporter. You can do that easily either through patreon.com, www.patreon.com/independentpianist, or I also have a link to my PayPal account where you can make a one-time donation. So thank you very much for watching this week's video, and until next week, this is Cole Anderson signing off.